Maseches Yevamos Daf Ayin is all about the topic of who may eat truma and who may not. We end the seventh parak of the Masechta with a quick discussion of the sources of the halacha of a mamzer, an eved, and a kohen gadol who are a woman's grandchildren, what effect they have on her right to eat truma, and the sources of those halachos are. Then we begin the eighth parak ha'aro, which changes from talking about psulim that are innate, part of the nature, the birth, who a person is, to psulim for truma that are temporary, transient states, such as not having a bris milah or being tamei or having an injury. The Mishnah will list those psulim, and then the Gemara will discuss the sources for each of them. So let's begin. We begin several lines into the daf at the two dots where we had seen in the Mishnah that an eved, who is a woman's grandchild, does not have an effect on her status to eat a truma, is not considered to be her child. So the Gemara says, what's the source of that? The Gemara says, so Isha v'yiladeh atiyah ladeneho, when an eved gives birth to a child, the child is considered to belong to the owner, and therefore it does not have an effect on his grandmother, not considered to be the grandmother's grandchild. Therefore, if she's a bas kohen, she continues to eat truma even if she was married to Yisrael, and this is her only child from the Yisrael. And if she was a bas Yisrael, she does not eat truma, even though this is a grandchild from her husband who was a kohen. Okay, now the Gemara goes on to a mamzer. We said that a mamzer does count as her child. The Gemara has two chidushim here. Chidush number one is that a mamzer who's a puzzle still counts as a child. Chidush number two is that a grandchild counts as a child. So what's the source of these two halachos? The Gemara blames both of them on the phrase Zera Ein La. The Gemara reads it as Ayin La, look deeply and count things which you may have thought not to count. So we count even a puzzle as a child as far as this halacha, and we also count a grandchild. So the Gemara says you can't use two for one. You can only learn one thing out of there. So the Gemara says, so you don't need a pasuk for a grandchild. You have a rule, b'nei banim arehim k'banim, grandchildren count as children, and therefore you don't need that. This is just to say that a mamzer, even though he's a puzzle, still counts as a child of the grandmother, and therefore gives her the status of her husband's family. Now, the Gemara asks, in our Mishnah, when we discussed a mamzer, the example we gave for the mamzer was that if the woman has a daughter and that daughter marries an eved or an eved kechavim and gives birth to a mamzer. So the Gemara says that Mishnah seems to be going only according to Rabbi Akiva, because it says that in a bas Yisrael who has a child from an eved or an eved kechavim, the child's a mamzer. Eved or kechavim is only a lav. Rabbi Akiva is the one who holds that a mamzer is born from a lav. So Gemara says no, it's even the Rabbanan. The Rabbanan hold most lavin don't create mamzeros. However, they agree that an eved and eved kechavim do create mamzeros. And the Gemara quotes a source of that in a Mishnah and a statement later of Rav Dimi in the name of Rav Yitzchak bar Rav Dimi in the name of Rabbeinu. Okay, next the Gemara just has one brief comment on the fact that a kohen gadol grandchild can take away a woman's right to eat truma. That is, if she's a bas kohen married to Yisrael and the only surviving child, and he dies, the only surviving child she has is this kohen gadol, her daughter's son, takes away to eat truma. On the other hand, a mamzer, if she was bas Yisrael married to a kohen, can give her the right to eat truma. So the Gemara says, you have a phrase on this, Harini kaparas ben biti kuza, I am mourning over my grandson, my daughter's son, even though he's small, meaning he's a mamzer, he gave me the right to eat truma. As opposed to Eini kaparas ben biti kada, I am not mourning over my grandson who is big, he's a kohen gadol, because he took away my right to eat truma. Okay, that concludes parak almana kohen and gadol, the seventh parak. Now we begin the eighth parak ha'aro, and we're going to be discussing transient psulim. So the Mishnah lists someone who does not have a bris milah is not allowed to eat truma. Somebody who's tamei and is not allowed to eat truma. Now they are allowed to feed truma to their wives and to their avadim. That's because they have a etzem innate right to eat truma. There's just a temporary condition that prevents them from eating truma, but innately they do have the right to eat truma, and therefore their wives and their household, their wives and their avadim do eat truma. Now, another example, the Mishnah lists is a petu adaka and a kros shafcha. That's somebody who has an injury to his male organs, which makes it forbidden for him to have via or marry a Jewish woman. Here, it depends if he did anything when that condition developed. So his avadim are allowed to eat truma for sure. He has the right to eat truma, but etzem he just has this condition that prevents him from being able to eat truma. What about his wife? So if the condition developed after they were already married and he didn't do any bia, then there's no reason to passel her. She has the right to eat truma, just like the Eved does. If, however, he did a bia, or he married her after he was already in this injured condition, then she did an iser by having a bia with him, and that passels her from truma, so she can't eat truma anymore. Now the Mishnah is going to define what exactly is a petua daka, or what's a cross shafcha. So the Mishnah defines petua daka is one whose veitim are crushed, and a cross shafcha is one whose male organ has been cut off. It's only the part that counts as the organ itself, not the fleshy part at the end. And the border is the atara, which the Mishnah refers to often. Rashi defines that as the highest ridge near the end from where it begins to slope downward. If any part of the atara still remains, the only thing that's missing is what's after that, towards the outer edge of the body. Then that doesn't count as missing part of the actual organ itself, and therefore he still remains a kosher. He does not count as a cross shafcha. Okay, now the Gemara begins. The Gemara is going to focus on how do you know that an oral, how do you know that somebody does not have a bris milah is not allowed to eat truma. The Gemara is going to learn that from Karban Pesach, and the Gemara is going to wonder how the limud works. The Gemara will have two explanations of that. Then the Gemara will ask, well, once you have that connection between truma and Karban Pesach, why don't you learn other things from there as well? So let's begin. So the Gemara asks, how do you know that an oral? And again, here when we say an oral, we're referring to somebody who was permitted to be without a bris milah. He's from a family that it's a sakana for them to have a bris. However, he is unable to eat truma. It is forbidden for an oral to eat truma. So the Gemara says, how do you know that? The Gemara gives two sources. We'll do the second one first because the Gemara doesn't discuss it on this stuff. Rabbi Kiva says on the list of people who are not allowed to eat truma, it uses the phrase ish ish. It says the phrase ish twice. It says ish ish mizera aron v'hutzuru azav v'kachem lo yochal. The double use of the word ish is to include an oral, to include someone extra, and it's to include someone who doesn't have a bris milah. Now, that's Rabbi Kiva's approach. Rav Elazar has a different approach, and he says there is a connection to Karban Pesach, just like someone who's an oral is not allowed to eat from a Karban Pesach, he's not allowed to eat from Truma as well. What's the connection? The phrase Toshav v'Sachir, both in Karban Pesach and in Truma, the phrase Toshav v'Sachir is used in describing who's allowed to eat it, and therefore an oral, just like an oral is excluded from the list of people who can eat a Karban Pesach, he's excluded from the people who can eat from Truma. So now the Gemara's question is this phrase extra? If you're just noting that the same words or phrase appears in two places, you can learn a halacha from that connection unless I have a reason to say that it should only apply in the place where it's written, and here I do. It makes sense for a Karban Pesach to be stricter than Truma, because a Karban Pesach has halachas which carry kares. Somebody who eats it as pigul, nosar, that's left over, or tamei. Pigul is as if it's brought with kavana to be eaten in the wrong time, the wrong place. Any of these three things make it an iser kares to eat from that meat. You don't have such halacha by Truma. So since Karban Pesach has a stricter halacha, it makes sense for me to say that the halacha that a oral is not allowed to eat from, it applies only there, not in the more lenient halacha, which is that of eating Truma. So since I can have a logical reason to say that you shouldn't learn the preclusion, the exclusion of an oral from Pesach to Truma, you have to have an extra phrase. These words, Tosha v'Sachar, have to be extra. If they're just common without being extra, you can't make that limud. So the Gemara says, yes, they are extra. The phrase Tosha v'Sachar is extra. So, says the Gemara, which phrase is it extra? Which phrase is extra? Is it extra to say Tosha v'Sachar by Truma, or is it extra to say it by Pesach? So what does Toshav V'Sachar mean? Now, Toshav V'Sachar both refer to an Eved Ivri, a Jewish Eved, and Toshav is a permanent Eved. That's one who has already passed his 6-year freedom date, chosen to stay longer, had his ear drilled, and now is staying until Yovel. A Sachir is one who is within his original 6 years and is set to go free at the end of 6 years. The halacha is telling us that if they are a Yisrael, this Eved Ivri is a Yisrael, and he belongs to a Kohen, does not get the right to eat Truma from his owner, the Kohen, because he's not considered to be a complete possession, not part of the Kohen's household. He's still independent, he's still his own Jew, and he still has his own halachos, and he doesn't get the right truma based on that. So it says, why do you have to tell me both of these? You want to tell me that they don't belong to him, so it's enough to tell me that a Toshav Olam until Yovel, who has a long-term contract, doesn't belong to him and doesn't get the right to truma from his owner. You don't have to tell me that a Sachir, who is a short-term contract, doesn't belong to his owner. Says the Gemara, no. it's not extra, because the phrase Toshav and Tzachir, neither of them innately mean either an Eved Olam or an Eved of 6 years. Each one could mean either of them. So therefore, I would automatically assume, if it only said one of them, I would assume that's a smallest chiddush. I would assume that it's talking about the 6-year Eved, and he's the one who doesn't get the Truma from his owner, the Kohen, because he's only a short-term arrangement and he doesn't belong to the owner. I wouldn't know it by the case of someone who is an Eved until Yovel. I have to tell me both of them to show that both of these, having both words, one must be referring to a short term and the other is referring to a long term, and both of them don't get the right to Truma based on that. So it's not extra here. So it says, okay, let's go to Carbon Pesach. Why does it say Toshav and Tzachir don't eat from a Carbon Pesach? Says the Gemara, cannot possibly be coming to tell me that an Eved Ivri doesn't eat from a Carbon Pesach. An Eved Ivri is a Jew. He eats from a Carbon Pesach in his own right. If he belonged to his owner and he didn't have his own power to do mitzvahs, maybe. But you just told me he doesn't belong to owner. Neither of them belong to their owner. They don't get the right to Truma based on their owner. So he's his own person. He has his own chiv and mitzvah. So he has the obligation to eat from a Carbon Pesach just like everybody else. So what is it for? Obviously it's extra. Based on the fact that it's extra, we have an extra word which we can use for our connection, and therefore I could learn that from Carbon Pesach to Truma, that a oral is excluded from the mitzvah. Okay, says the Gemara, the problem is that it's only extra on one of the two sides. You're connecting Pesach and Truma, and it's only extra on one of them. And the person who said this halacha is none other than Rabbi Elazar, who holds that in order to be able to learn from one place to another with something that needs to be extra, you got to have it extra on both sides. If it's only extra on one side, you can learn it, but only with the rules of commonality, and if I have a pircha, if I have a reason to show that it shouldn't be learned from one to the other, such as in this case, you can't learn it. So therefore in this case, I shouldn't be able to learn it. So the Gemara says you're going to have to show me that it's extra on both sides. The Gemara says, I can show you just as good. I can show you that both the word Toshav and the word Tzachir are both extra. Neither of them make sense in the context of Carbon Pesach. Therefore one's extra in Carbon Pesach, and the other one is going to be applied as if it were extra in the case of Truma. Now I have a virtual extra word on both ends of this connection, and therefore I can learn from Pesach to Truma. Okay, the Gemara accepts that. The Gemara says, okay, you have a very valid, unassailable link between Pesach and Truma. Based on that, you want to learn just like by Pesach and Arl is excluded, by Truma and Arl is also excluded. My question is, why don't you learn other halachas from Pesach to Truma as well? In Onein, that's somebody who lost a close relative before the Kefura, this is the status of Aninus, he does not eat from the Carbon Pesach. He does, however, eat Truma. What is the reason that he eats Carbon Pesach and not Truma? Why don't you learn from the connection of Pesach to Truma that just like he's excluded from the mitzvah of Carbon Pesach, he's excluded from the mitzvah of Truma as well? So the Gemara says the reason is because I have a pasuk that specifically includes him. It says V'chol zor lo yochel bo. It's only a zor, only a non-Kohen who's excluded from eating Truma. However, an Onein is included, and Onein does eat Truma. So the Gemara immediately asks, you don't have anything about that pasuk that specifically refers to an Onein, maybe refers to an Aro. Maybe it's that it's coming to say, oh, only a Zar is excluded, but an Arel is included. How do you know that this inclusory phrase is to include an Onein and not an Arel? So the Gemara says, what do you mean? We already excluded an Arel from the phrase Toshav V'Sachir. So the Gemara says, all right, let's break it down here. Neither of these refer specifically to either. So you have one inclusion, Toshav V'Sachir. You have one inclusion, which is V'chol zar, and one exclusion Toshav Sachir. You're telling me that I'm including Onein, excluding Arel. How do you know which one? Maybe you should do the opposite. Gemara says, no, it's logical. There are 5 ways in which the Arel is stricter than the Onein. And if I'm going to exclude someone, it should be based on that strictness, the strictness of what he has. What are the 5 ways in which he's stricter? First of all, he's missing an action. It's something he needs to do. The Onein doesn't need to do anything. He's in a semi-status of mourning. There's nothing he needs to do. The Arel has got to do a bris milah. He's missing the bris milah. Second point is that the thing that he needs to do is in his body. His body requires a change. That's very serious. The Onein doesn't have to do anything in the body. Third, not having a bris milah is something which carries the penalty of kares. Aninus doesn't carry any kares. Fourth, the mitzvah of milah was given before Har Sinai. That's a special stringency. Aninus was not. And fifth, if somebody has a son or an Eved who's missing a bris milah, he can't eat from the Korban Pesach either. You don't have the halacha if somebody has a son or an Eved who's an onein, he can't eat from the Korban Pesach. Therefore, the stricter, stronger halacha is Arel, and therefore I should learn that just like that's excluded from a Korban Pesach, it's excluded from Truma. But I'm not going to learn Aninus. Aninus, I'll say that's the one that's included. Says Gemara, what do you mean? Aninus is stricter in its own way as well. Aninus is stricter because it applies at all times. A person can be an onein many times in his life. A person can only be an Arel once. Once it gets to bris milah, that's over. Second of all, Aninus applies to women as well. Bris milah does not apply to women. And third, Aninus can't be fixed. If Aninus happens, there's nothing you can do about it. Milah, a person can fix the problem and give himself a milah. Therefore, you got three ways in which Aninus is the stronger halacha. And I should learn that from Aninus, I should learn Aninus from Pesach to Truma, just like an onein is excluded from Pesach, he should be excluded from Truma. Where it says, no, that's only stricter in three ways. On the other hand, Arel is stronger in 5 ways. So therefore, that's the stronger one. It says the Gemara, there's another answer. And that's that the exclusion of Arel from Korban Pesach is written in the Parsha explicitly. The exclusion of onein from Korban Pesach is learned out of Meiser. So if I'm going to learn something from Pesach to Truma, and I don't know what, I'm going to learn the thing which is innate in Pesach, not the thing which is coming to Pesach from somewhere else. Therefore, I'm going to learn the exclusion of Arel and not the exclusion of Aninus. Okay, now there was another question, another thing we should learn from Pesach to Truma, and that's the exclusion of someone who owns an Eved or has a son who doesn't have a bris milah. Just like that passes him from Korban Pesach, it should passel him from Truma as well. Why don't you say that? So the Gemara is going to go through a similar style discussion as we did before about Aninus. The Gemara says we have a phrase that says Umalta Oisai Oz Yoichal Boy. You should do a bris milah on that Eved and on that son, then you can eat in it. This is halacha that only applies to it, only applies to Korban Pesach. It does not apply to something else. It doesn't apply to Truma. Says the Gemara, you have the same phrase by as far as it applies as in the discussion of an Arel. When the Torah says that an Arel can't eat Korban and Pesach, it says Kol Arel Yochal Boy. An Arel can't eat this, implying that he could eat something else, and he could eat Truma. So the Gemara says, no, but we already included in Arel from Toshav and Sacher. The Gemara says, okay, but how do you know that Toshav and Sacher applies to an Arel and not to somebody whose children or Avadim don't have a bris milah? So the Gemara says, again, let's stack up what is more severe and what is more lenient. Somebody who doesn't have a bris milah himself is more severe because it's a ma'aseh begufa, it carries kares. Says the Gemara, but on the other hand, milah is more severe because milah, that is, milah of his Eved and his son are more severe because that is something that applies many times. It applies every time he has an Eved and every time he has a son. His own milah only happens once. So where it says, okay, well, that's only one chumrah, but his own meal has 2 chumras. Another answer, you can't possibly tell me that I should learn the restriction as far as one son and Eved and not as far as himself. You mean to tell me that Truma is going to come up with the following halacha? If somebody doesn't have a bris milah himself, he's allowed to eat Truma, but if his Eved and son don't have a bris milah, we're going to learn from Korban Pesach that he can't eat Truma. How does that make any sense? If it applies to his Eved and his son as a psul for eating Truma, certainly on him himself, it's a psul for eating Truma. And therefore I have to say that what we learn from Korban Pesach is himself, not the Eved. Alright, now the Gemara wants to analyze the fact that you're making a drasha from the word boy. You're telling me that when it says Yochal boy, it's only this and not something else. It says the Gemara, when it says Kol ben nechor lo yochal boy, anyone who's a stranger, meaning anyone who has moved his faith to other pathways, has become a mummar. So it says he can't eat it, but that implies something else he could eat. What's that for? What's the boy there? What could he eat? So the Gemara says it's only the Korban Pesach that he can't eat, but he's allowed to eat meiser. So says the Gemara, when it says Kol Arel lo yachal boy, what's that referring to? The Gemara says an Arel is not allowed to eat it, he's not allowed to eat Korban Pesach, but he is allowed to eat matzah and maror. Now, Says the Gemara, why do you have to say two different phrases here? Why do you have to say that an aro is excluded and then a ben nechar is excluded? Why do you need both of those? Somebody who's an aro is obviously a ben nechar as well. So the Gemara says the reason why I would think each one alone. If I only said an aro, there's something mias, something disgusting about an aro, and therefore I would think that he's excluded because of his mias. But a ben nechar, although he's an apikar, does not have that mias aspect. On the other hand, a ben nechar, I would think if it only said that he's the only one who's excluded because he's literally turned away from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. He's placed his faith elsewhere. That should not apply to an oral who still has faith. He just doesn't have the ability to do a milah, even if he's putter from doing the milah. Says you have a drasha from the word ba. You should also have a drasha from the word mimenu. It says should not eat mimenu, al techlu mimenu, from it, but something else you could eat from. What's that for? Versus that we'll discuss in Daf Ayin. Dalid Rabbah learns a number of things from that word. We'll discuss that when we get there.